Have you ever played Heretic?
No.
Have you ever played Hexen?
Who? These are the questions that gamers around the world are asking themselves today, as id Software have announced and released both of these games just today at QuakeCon.
And these retro re-release shadow drops have become a bit of a QuakeCon tradition. Last year saw the re-release of Doom 1 and Doom 2 with updated performance, multiplayer, soundtracks, mod support, and loads more, coming off of the heels of re-releases of Quake 2, Quake, and Doom 64 at QuakeCons before that, all through collaboration between id and the studio responsible for more 90s FPS re-releases than just about everyone else combined, Night Dive Studios. But the chances are you know Doom and Quake, that you've played them, maybe completed them. Doom and Quake are practically video game royalty, but Hexen and Heretic, they're sort of like Doom and Quake's creepy cousins. Published by id Software but developed by Raven, they were first person but with magical items instead of guns, a series that drifted further and further from their Doom engine roots the more it went on. So today we're going to talk to Stephen Kick from Night Dive and id Software's Mike Sponge Rubitz to talk about the legacy of Hexen and Heretic and why exactly they decided to re-release these games in 2025. And since I got access to this package weeks before QuakeCon, I'm going to give you my thoughts on whether or not this is a duo of games worth exploring again or jumping into for the very first time.
But first, it's been a while. Quick history lesson.
Heretic was released in 1994 by Raven Software under the watchful eye of producer John Romero. It played very much like Doom, but added some interesting elements such as light environmental destruction and an inventory system to store magical items. Its sequel, Hexen, was released in 1995, just 1 year later, but it was a fairly big diversion from the original, introducing both character classes and a hub world styled progression that had players backtracking and exploring areas over and over again in an attempt to find ways to progress. There are 2 more games in this series, a sequel to both Hexen and Heretic, but neither of those are in this recent package.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to be too reductive, but like Heretic in a lot of ways is medieval Doom. They do a lot of interesting stuff with the weapons, and we've made some gameplay and balance tweaks to make some of the weapons more useful too in the new re-release. But I feel like Heretic has aged a lot better than maybe it was back then, because back then the technology was changing every 6 months. We went from Commander Keen to Quake in 5 years, and now if you look at a game from 2020 to 2025, it's the same game pretty much. There's not been leaps, and we're going from platformers to full-on 3D engine in that period. So I think Heretic got a little lost in that shuffle from just the technology curve, and now that people like that aesthetic nowadays, and people will actually make games in that aesthetic. I think it really makes Heretic stand out as this kind of like forgotten classic. And then on the Hexen side, its sense of environment, like an immersion, that the kind of like weird atmosphere of music, it's such a different vibe compared to the Doom games, or like really most of the other id games.
The number one thing that stands out to me still is just how bullet spongy some of the enemies are. Like you could just sit there with the mouse button down and just be like, come on, just die already. I want to keep going. Yeah, I don't remember beating it that first time, but more recently, a couple years ago, I put up, the original versions on my Pentium 3 800 to get through them, to experience them as they were originally released. And it was a challenge between, the levels being extremely labyrinthian. It's on theme with the fantasy, the dark, dungeon setting and everything like that. But yeah, having been used to playing Doom and everything else, it was like, you kind of had to rewire your brain for that particular experience. Even just understanding what some of the power-ups and the pickups did, because it doesn't necessarily explain to you what they do right away. So it's like, what does that do? When should I use that? Because there's like more strategy involved than what we were used to, at least when we all played Doom first, right?
Heretic and Hexen were both doing a lot of new stuff back then, maybe a little too much, which is probably why people don't really recommend these games a lot in 2025. So while these re-releases incorporate all of the bells and whistles of the previous re-release projects, the teams at id and Night Dive decided to tweak some elements of gameplay too. Both ideas they had themselves and some established best practices they pulled from the community of folks who have been modding these games over the past few decades.
You want to show these games as people remembered them and not necessarily how they really were. You know, a lot of us played Doom when we were younger on like 486s, ran like 20 FPS at 320 by 200. It looked awful. You still want to keep the game the way it is. You know, we're not gonna add 3D models for all the enemies or stuff like that. It's still gonna pretty much play the same, but just with some of the rougher edges smoothed off and running smoother in high resolution. On the Heretic side, we worked with an author of a mod called The Wayfarer's Tome, a guy by the name of Not Jabba. He basically kind of looked at all the Heretic weapons and enemies and rebounced them. You know, the original games, the enemies were kind of spongy. You would just need a lot of shots to take down some of those guys. And you know, it's just like, you know, you're not really testing the player's skill by doing that. You're just kind of using up their time. So we integrated that officially, just kind of pacings up the game a bit and keeps you on your toes. On the Hexen side, we did a lot of those similar tweaks. The most visible one would be for the cleric. We added the shield, because I mean, you can't have a cleric without a shield. Like, what are you doing there? And along with that, we added parrying, because everyone knows parrying systems now. So you can parry projectiles and melee attacks, and it'll kind of put the enemies into a stun for a second, and you can get one big hit on them. It makes the cleric just feel a lot more different, because a lot of games have still not figured out melee in first person. It is incredibly hard to do that well, and very few people have. And trying to do it on the Doom engine in that time frame is just like, it's amazing. It feels as good as it does even back then.
Given how idiosyncratic these games are, I was curious why all of this work was being done to update them. I'm a big fan of game preservation and making old titles available on as many platforms as possible, especially as they're giving this away to people who already own the games on Steam, and it's coming out on Game Pass too.
But given the absolute murderer's row of classic id Software titles that have yet to receive a re-release, why Hexen and Heretic? And also, why not their really weird sequels?
So the boring answer is they're both Doom engine games. Hexen 2 was on the Quake 1 engine, and then Heretic 2 used the Quake 2 engine. We had just done all that work with Doom and Doom 2 with the multi-threaded renderer and all those enhancements, and like kind of actually seemed like a natural fit once we were able to realize that we could actually plop Heretic and Hexen to our engine.
But the games are using our Kex engine, which has powered everything that we've done so far in this relationship. So Doom 64, Quake 2, Doom 1, Doom 2. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward because our guys are so familiar with the code now. It's just a matter of kind of bringing it up to the standards of the other releases that we've done and making sure it all runs across all the supported platforms. And yeah, they're some of the smoothest projects that we do now, just because of the support we get and the familiarity with the assets.
Heretic and Hexen has been kind of lost in this like kind of publisher shuffle where id and Activision neither of us had the full rights for it. So now we're obviously able to work that out and able to make it happen. Yeah, you know, we had the versions up on Steam, but they're just sort of the DOSBox wrapped versions, and you know, they work well enough. A lot of people would play through source ports. I know GZ Doom supports it. International Heretic and Hexen, those are really good ways to play those games, but obviously having it on Game Pass and then having it on PlayStation and Switch is just anywhere that there's a screen, we want to try and get the game onto it and let people play it.
As our good friend Sponge just said, the Microsoft acquisition of Activision has simplified some of the copyright issues with these id-published, Raven-developed games. Probably more so with Heretic 2, which is essentially abandonware at the moment. Hopefully something that id and or Night Dive can fix in the future, if the source code is still available, that is.
I would like to do Heretic 2 for sure. I feel like they started to figure out the third-person stuff in that game. And you know, maybe it was a little rough and all that, but yeah, I mean, I feel like it was just like a solid kind of third-person shooter, which is also bizarre. Like a third-person shooter on the PC in the 90s, like, is just such a weird thing to me.
As this re-release focuses on the first two games, I have to focus on that and whether these games are worthy of your time. And on a purely technical level, this all feels solid. My experience of the original and the source ports is limited, but coming to these games with fresh eyes, I had no issues with how they ran, looked, or sounded. From a gameplay perspective, it's difficult to divorce the experience of playing these games from the historical preservationist nature of doing so. These feel like old games. Heretic is a lot closer to the run and gun experience of Doom, but Hexen is as strange as it ever was. Yes, the team has shaved off some of those rougher edges, but there's no denying the fact that the level design can be incredibly frustrating, even with a guide. And these games can be ruthlessly hard, especially again in Hexen, where it often feels like you're seconds away from dying. I think once the games are out and some of the fan-made mods appear, it might help, in particular having some sort of autosave feature, especially in Hexen. But if you're interested in this package, it's probably not to play the latest and greatest first-person shooters. These games are both museum pieces and a window into a bit of a game design cul-de-sac when fantasy wasn't nearly as popular as it was post Elder Scrolls 4, when the real nerds were enjoying Ultima Underworld. So from a purely preservationist perspective, I'm really glad these are out there, available on a wide variety of platforms, free for folks who already own them on Steam, and available on Game Pass. But here's my hot take of how to enjoy this. I think maybe people should play the 2 new episodes first. This package actually comes with 5 games in it: Heretic, Hexen, Hexen's official expansion pack Death Kings of the Dark Citadel, and 2 brand new episodes, 1 for each game. Faith Renewed for Heretic, and for Hexen there's Vestiges of Grandeur, which even for a Doom Engine episode title is pretty ridiculous. I actually thought both of these new episodes did a really great job of onboarding me into the experience of their games. For instance, showing the player that some door switches might be hidden behind panes of glass, something the original game never bothered to explain. My only blind spot here is that I didn't play any of the multiplayer, but I'm excited to do so this week at QuakeCon. I'll be there again this year filming some stuff and playing topless Quake 3 with the A2M folks. Look out for a video on all of that in the not too distant future. But before we wrapped up, I wanted to ask them what it's like for the teams at id and Nightdive to not only announce and release these games at QuakeCon, but then to immediately be able to walk over to the LAN area and see people playing the games right away.
You know, the news kind of was coming up about the QuakeCon again coming to Dallas and everything like that. There was a lot of message threads that were like, what game do you think Nightdive is gonna release? And 75% of the answers were Hexen Heretic.
Why do you think that is?
It just fits so perfectly into everything else that we've done. It's almost like we didn't want to leave it behind, I think, before moving on to something from a later generation like post Quake 2. Like we kind of had to clear that up first before moving on. Yeah, we're definitely going to see a lot of people at QuakeCon playing Hexen and Heretic. Maybe way more so than in prior years. But last year was really cool with Doom 1 and Doom 2. It was like half the people there were playing online, and because the network is so fast and everyone's like right in your vicinity, it just got really really spicy. It was really fun.
Every person who releases a game is watching Twitch streams of their new game, especially when you're at like the AAA companies and stuff. Everyone's doing that the days after. But yeah, being able to just walk around, and a lot of people know who I am there and know that I work on it, so they're just always super happy to come up to me and talk about it and usually pitch whatever game they want us to do next.